Okay, so we've already talked about factoring. Factoring is one way to find the solution for a quadratic, but not all quadratic equations can be factored. So then what will we do? So there's actually two other methods that we are going to learn about that will also allow you to find the solutions to a quadratic. So now let's talk about the quadratic formula. You don't have to memorize this formula. When you look at it, it's derived of x equals negative b plus or minus b squared minus 4ac all over 2a. And you substitute in the values of a, b, and c, and you simply simplify. This part of the quadratic formula, this part right here, this b squared minus 4ac, is called the discriminant. And there is a question in your homework that asks you about the importance of the discriminant. So now let's talk about that. Why is that part of the quadratic formula so important? So the discriminant, which is again the part underneath the square root, will tell you how many solutions you're going to have. So there are three options. The first option is that you get a positive number. If that number underneath the square root is positive, that means that you have two real solutions. When you look at this graph, notice how the parabola is crossing through the x-axis twice. That means it has two different solutions, and we can know that the discriminant is positive. We may not know what that discriminant is when looking at a picture. However, if we see that it has two x-intercepts, that discriminant must be a positive number. The second option would be that you get the number 0. And that doesn't happen often, but when that does, that means that you have one repeated root. All right, it's called a double root, but when you're looking at a parabola, it only touches the x-axis one time. And the third and final option for your discriminant is that it is negative. Well, what happens when this number here is negative? When it's negative, there are no real solutions. And we're going to talk about that a lot more in Appendix 7. But that means that you have no real solutions. What you do have, in fact, are two imaginary or complex solutions. Notice that the parabola does not come down far enough to touch the x-axis. It does not have an x-intercept. So we're going to do two questions in which we practice the quadratic formula. Okay, so again, feel free to pause the video at any time. When we look at question A, the A value is in front of x squared. So A is 1. B is negative 4. And C is positive 2. I like to start with a discriminant, which again is this part underneath the square root right here. Let me switch colors so you can see that. Let me go to red. This part here, that's my discriminant. So I'm going to start off with that. So always put your negatives in parentheses when you're putting it in your calculator, because that will affect your answer. B squared minus 4 times A times C. Okay, pause the video and type that in your calculator. You should get 8. So our solutions, because this is positive, I know that I have two real solutions. So I'm looking for two answers because that 8 is a positive 8. So So we have x equals negative b, which is the opposite, so that's a positive 4, plus or minus the square root of 8, divided by 2 times a, which is 2. Eight can be simplified because there's a perfect square. And the perfect square that is a factor of 8 is 4. So I'm going to break that 8 down to 4 times 2. The only time that it is okay to split apart a square root is if you're taking out a perfect square. If you cannot, then we are not going to split it apart. All right, so then that's going to simplify down to 2 square root of 2 all over 2. And our last step here is to simplify. We're going to look at our triangle. All right, those three numbers, the 4, the 2, and the 2 in the denominator, not the 2 underneath the square root, to see if we can simplify that even more. And we can, because we can divide those numbers by 2. Our final answer is x equals 2 plus or minus the square root of 2. That is where the x-intercepts are on that parabola. Okay. So now let's look at the second question. In our second question, a is 4, b is negative 1, c is positive 2. So again, let's start off with finding out our discriminant. B squared, again there's a negative, so put that in parentheses, minus 4 times a times c. Pause the video, type that in your calculator to see what you get. And you should get negative 31. Now, because this is a negative discriminant, we know that there are no real solutions. No real solutions. We're looking for 2 imaginary. So if we were to graph this parabola, it's not going to come down far enough to touch the x-axis. All right, so now let's go ahead. Now that we know that part, this number here is negative 31. Let's go ahead and fill in the rest and simplify. So x equals the opposite of b, and the opposite of a negative 1 is a positive 1, plus or minus the square root of negative 31 all over 2 times a. Now, when we simplify a negative, remember we have to take out a negative 1, okay? And the square root of negative 1 is I. And we're going to talk about that a lot more in Appendix 7. But for now, just know that the square root of negative 31 is equal to I root 31. So our final answer, I'm going to write that final answer in green, will be 1 plus or minus I square root of 31 all over 8.